All right, on to passage 4 for the ACT English Practice Test 3. Let's get to it. This is called the Beltway, Washington's Expressway. And this passage is about the narrator's experience visiting Washington, D.C., where she didn't spend her time visiting, all the attractions like the Lincoln Memorial, but this giant freeway type of structure and her experiences on it. So let's get to the first question. If you visit our nation's capital recently, as I did, you will probably plan trips to several of the famous memorials there. Okay. The problem is that with this first answer choice, if it says, if you visit our nation's capital, that's like saying, well, if you do this on a general basis, if you do this most likely in the future, but recently means something that was done in the past. So there's a clash there. There's a time tense problem there. So F would be wrong. If you look at G, recently visit our nation's capital, that has the same problem. It basically just moves recently to before visit. So that's like saying, if you eat this recently, you might like it. Well, that doesn't make sense, because if I say if you eat this or if you visit our nation's capital, that's talking about if you do this on a general basis, most likely if you do this in the future, and recently actually means something that happened in the past. H, same problem. You get that recently. But J, it says, if you visit our nation's capital, as I did recently. The recently only follows I did, and so it's only modifying or addressing her own trip, or the narrator's own trip to Washington, D.C. So that makes sense. So that's why for 46, J is the answer. All right, 47. Given that all the choices are true, which one would conclude this sentence by providing the clearest examples of some of the attractions that are available in the nation's capital? All right. It says, many of which, so it says, to several of the famous memorials there, many of which you have probably seen on television. So they're saying, which provides the clearest examples of some of the attractions that are available in the nation's capital? Well, many of which you have probably seen on television. Are those very clear examples? Just saying, oh, you've probably seen these attractions on TV? Well, they're not really clear examples, right? It's not an irrelevant point, but let's see if there's something better. What about including the ones that are readily recognizable to us? That's even more general. That's like saying, not even the ones that you've seen on TV, the ones that are, oh, you probably know what they are. So that probably isn't the best one. What about C, including the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial? That's very clear. Those are two very specific examples of attractions in Washington, D.C. And then D, those structures that potentially add to the history of the capital. Also kind of vague, certainly not as clear as C, where they literally say two examples, straight from the site. So the answer choice that makes most sense is C. All right, now on number 48, the sentence says, these celebrated landmarks were designed to inspire feelings of patriotism and pride. Nevertheless, the structure I remember most vividly from my trip was an expressway called the Washington Beltway, which seems to be a memorial to the frenzied and crazy lunacy of modern life. Okay, well, what they want you to do is examine whether this adverb transition phrase or transition word nevertheless fits here logically. So this isn't really a grammatical issue. So it's talking about how these Washington monuments inspire pride and Washington landmarks inspire pride or patriotism. Oh, America's so great, whatever. But what does she remember most? What does the narrator remember most? The expressway, like the giant freeway. So that's kind of a contrast there, isn't it? Well, nevertheless is kind of a contrast transition phrase or transition word. So this seems to work. What about therefore? Therefore basically means the same thing as a result. They mean one leads to another. And so does it make sense where she talks about how Washington landmarks inspire feelings of, oh, America is so great. And then she talks about how she remembers the freeway. No, that wouldn't make sense. So G and H wouldn't work, therefore, and as a result. What about in addition? In addition just means also. So this is certainly not something that's an also. This is not something that's an addition to the prior point. This is something that's completely opposite of what you would normally expect, given what she talks about. What she should, or what most people do remember when they go to Washington D.C. She remembers instead, this giant freeway, which is sort of a very unattractive part of the city. The answer is no change. 49. All right, which seems to be a memorial to the frenzied and crazy lunacy of modern life. All right, this is an issue of redundancy. If something is frenzied, it's sort of a bit chaotic. And then if you say crazy lunacy, that's more of the same thing. Crazy is also redundant with lunacy. So you basically have three words here that more or less mean the same thing. Is that really necessary? Probably not. So let's see what they have. A, no change. Well, that wouldn't work because you definitely have multiple sources of redundancy. What about B, frenzy of modern life? Or frenzy of modern in this case. Yeah, that seems to make sense. It uses frenzy of modern life, sure. What about frenzy of modern contemporary? Well, contemporary means modern, okay? So it doesn't have the, redundancy of frenzied and crazy, but it does add contemporary, which is redundant with modern. And what about D, confused disarray? Well, if something is in disarray, it means it's, there's a degree of confusion there. So these two words are also redundant with each other. So the only answer choice that doesn't have repetition, that doesn't have unnecessary wordiness or redundancy is B. All right, 50. It says this express at 10 lanes wide, they are much larger than the bypass loops I have driven around Indianapolis and Cincinnati. Well, what is they? What is they referring to? That's a pronoun, right? It needs to refer to something. Well, let's look at the prior sentence. It says this expressway resembles an ordinary highway about as much as a space shuttle resembles an airplane. So what is the noun? That's the noun that this is supposed to describe. Because what's 10 lanes wide? The expressway, right? Expressway is like saying a freeway. So is this right? Is this the right tense? No, that couldn't be the right tense. What should it be? Well, expressway is singular, so you should change they to it and are to is. So number 50, you look at 50, F wouldn't work. But what about G? It is. Sure, that works. What about H? It was? No, this isn't past tense. This is a present tense situation. We're talking about that expressway, which still exists. And what about they were? This is past tense and it's plural, so it's wrong for both reasons. So the only answer choice that makes sense is G. All right, on to 51. It says, the Beltway is also far more busier, perhaps because, okay, well, obviously this is what we need to be focused on. And in English, you basically have two different main ways of comparing things. You either say it's more than something else or it's the most. And for most words probably, you would just change the ending to IER for more and then EST for most. So with busy, you get busier as comparing to something, to one other thing, or busiest when you compare it to multiple things, okay, as the most something. Well, with other words, you can't actually change it to IER. You just leave it as is. So let's say you take the adjective tasteful. You don't say tastefuler or tastefulest. You just say more tasteful or most tasteful. And then for, the opposite, less tasteful, least tasteful. Well, in this case, they're doing it twice. They're doing the more and the IER. Okay, it's just one or the other. It's not both. So this is an error. You'd have to basically, in this case, busier is correct, so you'd have to take out the more. Well, what about the far? Far is not about comparison. Far just shows the extent of. So you can say it's far busier, so that would make sense. And would this be a comparison of busier or busiest? Well, it does seem like it's busier is fine, because what is it comparing it to? She says, I have driven through around Indianapolis and Cincinnati. She's just comparing it to other places she's been. She's saying this is far busier than that. And this is sort of a combined example that she's using. So in this case, it does seem to be far busier as the most likely answer choice. Let's see if there's anything better. Far busier, B. No change wouldn't work. More busier has that same problem of combining the two ways of comparing things grammatically. And then most busiest does the exact same thing, just in the superlative form, which is comparing multiple items. So in this case, far busier is the best answer choice, B. What about 52? 52 says, perhaps because it extends through two populous states, Virginia and Maryland, and intersecting with many lesser highways. That's about it. Okay. Well, does this make sense? The part to focus on, it says, perhaps because it extends through two populous states. Ignore the stuff in the dashes. That's just like parentheses, more detail. Perhaps because it extends through two populous states. And what? And intersecting with many lesser highways. What should be here is a verb, okay? It extends through here and extends with and intersects with many lesser highways, or intersects many lesser highways, okay? In this case, intersecting is not the same as intersects. Intersecting is a verb form. It's a participle. By itself, it can't be a verb. It needs something to go along with it. Like is intersecting, was intersecting, or has been intersecting. In this case, it's just by itself. So this is basically makes that second part incomplete. That needs to be changed. So what about F, no change? No change doesn't work. What about J? Well, and doesn't work, because if you just say and with many lesser highways, and with many lesser highways, what? There's supposed to be something there. As in, it extends through these populous states and does something else. And what? If you just have and with the preposition, you just leave that hanging. Okay? So and does not work. What about but intersects? Because you have but intersects and you have and intersects. Well, let's see which one makes sense. Perhaps because it extends through two populous states and intersects, or but intersects. Well, if you have and, that would make sense, because it's talking about what? How this beltway is very busy. It goes through two different major states with a lot of people there, and it intersects with a bunch of other stuff. Meaning, it's huge. It goes very far, and it kind of crisscrosses other highways. That makes sense. But doesn't make sense, because if it intersects other highways, that still makes it busier, right? So because both of these things make it busier, it should be an and. So in this case, the answer is H, and intersects. Let's go to 53. 53 says, it's also fast. The thousands of Washingtonians who dash from home to work and back sometimes ignore the posted speed limit. Okay, the problem here is that you have a run-on sentence with what's called a comma splice. It's just a comma separating two independent clauses with no conjunction. You would need some kind of conjunction just to connect these two sentences, but there's nothing there. Because you have a subject verb, it is, okay? And then you have a new subject, thousands, with a new verb, ignore. So you have two independent clauses and no proper conjunction in the middle, and as a result, this is wrong. What about these two choices, C and D. Well, C and D have the same problem. It's not it's also. It's in terms of ITS with no apostrophe. ITS with no apostrophe is possessive. That's like saying it belongs to what? It's what? You're kind of wondering, what is it? It's handbag, you know, it's color, something, but there's nothing there. Whereas it's with an apostrophe means it is, that needs to be there so that this is its own independent clause. It is subject verb. And what about B? Well, that's the only answer choice left, but is this colon appropriate? It's also fast, independent clause. What comes after colon should be either a list or a description of what came before the colon. And what came after the colon can be an independent clause with a subject and verb. It also doesn't have to be. In this case it does. But if you have a colon here, does that second part describe why it's also fast, or describe how that beltway is very fast? Yeah, it does. It talks about how thousands of Washingtonians are sometimes zooming back and forth to work, ignoring all the road signs. You know, they're not even really going, you know, they're going way faster than they should, and maybe some other stuff. So the colon is used properly here, and it also makes sure that it uses the proper form. It is, not its. Okay? Okay, let's go to 54. 54, the one redeeming feature of the beltway. All right, this is an issue where they basically just put, unnecessary commas where they shouldn't be. What part of speech are these? They're both adjectives. But in this case, there shouldn't be any kind of, separation between anything. You can basically do this phrase, you can have this phrase without these commas. That if you really think about it, that's like saying, first of all, if you try to ignore that one, can you say the redeeming feature of the highway? Sure, you can say the redeeming feature of the highway, just like I can say, oh, that's a funny person. You don't need a comma after funny, right? Well, what if I say there are two funny people? Do I need a comma after two? No, I just say it as is. I just say two funny people, or three red tables. There's no need for a comma at all. You just say it straight through. Oh, so in this case, which answer choice does that? J does that. H has an unnecessary comma after beltway, and that's even worse. I don't know if you could say worse, but it's more striking. It sticks out more because it's a comma separating the subject and verb. That certainly is not supposed to be there. That's like saying, the steak, comma, is good. Well, you don't need to say the steak, comma, is good. You just say the steak is good. No need for a comma there. So H is certainly wrong. G just does basically mostly the same thing as F. It tries to separate this adjective from the noun that it's modifying. There's no need to do that at all. So J is the only correct possible answer. J. All right. It says, at this point, the writer is considering adding the following true statement. Atlanta and Houston also are surrounded by such giant loop highways. Should the writer make this addition here? Well, let's read it. At the end, it says, if you keep driving long enough, you will eventually circle the city and return to the point where you began. So what is this whole paragraph talking about? It's describing this Washington Beltway, right? The expressway there. And it talks about how it says, one redeeming feature, you can't get lost in it. And then you could basically circle the whole city just driving on it, right? Well, what about this? Atlanta and Houston also are surrounded by such giant loop highways. Okay, that sort of, I guess the author is mentioning two other cities that have these kinds of loop highways, but is that really relevant or specific to the Washington Beltway discussion, We're talking about the Washington Beltway, her experiences in Washington, D.C., and sort of just spending all this time driving on it and dealing with it, even though most people, when they go to Washington, D.C., the thing that they remember most or they spend the most time with are all the attractions. Should the writer make this addition here? It doesn't really seem like it, but let's go through the choices. Yes, because it informs the readers that such highways are not unique to Washington, D.C. Yeah, you could say it informs people, sure, but is that really relevant? Just because it informs people doesn't mean you should put it in. Just like I could have a random fact about how, I don't know, some people believe in ghosts. Yeah, okay, you could say it informs people. That really doesn't have to do specifically with the passage. Now, the example I gave is more obvious, but in this case, with these kinds of passages on the ACT, you want to make sure any addition that they make to the passage is very, very relevant, specifically to what's going on, okay? So if it doesn't seem very relevant to you, it's probably not correct. It probably shouldn't be added. What about B? Yes, because it helps the reader to better understand what the Beltway looks like. Does the reader need to, first of all, know what it looks like? Well, you can sort of gather from the passage that it kind of loops around, it intersects. I mean, readers pretty much should know what a giant freeway looks like, right? There is enough description. And does saying information about how Atlanta and Houston have giant loop highways help you visualize what it looks like better? It doesn't even really help you visualize it better, does it? It just says it, it doesn't describe it. So B wouldn't work either. What about C? No, because it distracts the reader from the main focus of the paragraph. Yeah, that seems to be the case, because what's the main focus of the paragraph? It's talking about how it's fast, you can't get lost on it, but then it talks about, other cities have this loopway. Well, that's a little different. That's kind of a different aspect of it. It's still talking about loopways and cities, but it's not specific to the point that paragraph is making. And then D, no, because it is inconsistent with the tone and style of the essay. Well, that's not really correct, because it is kind of consistent with the tone and style. There is, it's not like saying, like, hey, yo, what's up? Like, blah, blah, blah. There's nothing random like that. There's nothing, the essay is written in a somewhat, a little more than informal, a little more formal than informal way. But, there's nothing incredibly outside the norm. There's nothing incredibly formal or incredibly informal about this statement. So, that answer choice isn't right. The only answer choice that makes any kind of sense is C. All right. Given that all of the choices are true, which one would most effectively introduce this paragraph? Okay. She says, as I've already mentioned, I was on a visit to Washington. Well, what's this paragraph about? This paragraph, she says, I was staying with friends in the suburban Virginia home, and I asked them for help with alternate, more scenic routes. But by their puzzled looks, I realized they had surrendered to the Beltway long ago. So graciously, she said, I learned to navigate this expressway. So what is that about? Whatever introduces the paragraph needs to be roughly about what the paragraph is about, okay? The first sentence is called the topic sentence. It says the topic of the body paragraph. So that's about how she asked her friends, are there any other ways? And they're like, what are you talking about? So she's like, okay, I'll just take the expressway. Does that really relate to I was on a visit to Washington? Repeating just I was on a visit to Washington? No, I was on a visit to Washington is a general phrase. She could start talking about anything about Washington. It's not specific to the content of the paragraph. So F is wrong. What about initially, I plan to avoid driving on the Beltway? Sure, that works perfectly, because initially means at first. At first, I plan to avoid driving on the highway. So this implies that she tried in the beginning. She thought in the beginning she was thinking, oh, I'm not going to drive on that freeway, that highway. But then she had to change, because initially it just means at first, and it means at first and then something else happened. So that says what the body paragraph is about. What about H? The hustle and bustle was evident everywhere I went. Does that have to do with wanting to avoid the expressway and then needing to actually go on it? No, that doesn't. And what about J? The Beltway seems to turn official Washington into an island. That certainly doesn't have to do with her own experiences wanting to avoid it and then needing to actually drive on it. So this is more of a general description of, I guess, what the highway, I guess how it shapes the city. So the only choice that makes sense is G. 57. All right. She said, they had surrendered to the Beltway long ago. Graciously, I learned to navigate this expressway. Well, does that make sense, that adverb? Modifying that whole sentence. Graciously, what does graciously mean? It's kind of being very courteous, very courteously and very politely, or with grace, like, okay, I'll just do it, or okay, I'll navigate it and I'll be, I'll do it well, and thank you very much. Well, no, that doesn't really make sense, because what is the context of this? The context of it is she said, hey, friend, how do I, what are some better ways to drive around Washington, D.C.? I want to look at like pretty things. I don't want to drive on this highway. And the friends were like, no, you got to take it. There's like, what else would you take? You have to take it. So how would she feel after if she wanted to avoid the expressway to look at more scenic routes, more beautiful, I guess, scenery when she's driving, and then she realized, oh, she has to take it? Is she going to be necessarily really gracious about it, or is she going to be, oh, fine, okay? Well, she's going to be like that, right? Reluctant and sort of grudgingly, okay, I'll go along with it. So 57 graciously wouldn't work. It's not really an appropriate fit. She could have been polite, but that's not specific. That's not specifically the reaction she probably would have had. Okay. What about carefully, however? Is this about being careful? No, it's not about being careful. It's about contrast to what she was expecting to be able to do versus what she realizes she has to do. What about so unhappily? Oh, okay, that makes sense. So she's like, so as a result of finding out that what? She couldn't really drive on anything else. Unhappily, she's like, okay, I'll take the ugly freeway. That makes sense. What about in fact? In fact doesn't have any kind of contrast in it. And so unhappily is the answer choice that makes sense for this part. Okay? All right, question 58. 58 says, I approach it as if it were an unpredictable natural force that required careful monitoring. All right, the main problem that should stick out to you is the tense. Here you have past tense, and you have past tense here. And what this is saying is, I approached it in this way at this time. In my experience, or in the narrator's experience, when she was visiting Washington, D.C., and she had to drive on the expressway, she said, okay, I'm going to have this attitude about it, okay? Well, if you just say approach, that's talking about as if she drives on it every day or all the time, and she lives there, and on an ongoing basis, that's the attitude she takes. She approaches it in this way. Well, that's certainly not the case. This is a past tense issue, so approach needs to be changed to approach to fit all the other tenses and to make sense. So no change doesn't work. What about approached it? Well, the problem is, what's correct is you have this, past tense, but the problem is you have this unnecessary comma. You don't need that there. You just say, I approached it as if it were. As if it were is sort of an analogy comparison, and when you do that, when you have things like that, something as if, no need for a comma at all. So you just leave it. Approached it, fine, no comma. What about approach it? Well, you have that unnecessary comma again, and this is in the present tense. So the only answer choice that works is G. Okay, 59. Was it congested, overcrowded, moving freely? All right. If it's congested, is it probably overcrowded? if a freeway is congested, yeah, it means there's basically car, not a lot of space. So that is overcrowded. So would this work? No, it wouldn't work because while it grammatically makes sense, as in if you put it in Microsoft Word, you'd have no problem in grammar check. This is a redundant issue. You have repetition of words. So what they would want you to do is be able to identify that, and in this case, omit the underlined portion. Jammed with cars is the same as saying congested. Proceeding smoothly, that's the problem. The problem with that is moving freely is very similar to proceeding smoothly. Okay? So that would be an issue of redundancy and repetition. All right, let's go to 60. Which of the following sentences, if added here, would provide the best conclusion to the paragraph and is most consistent with the main focus of the essay? All right, so which sentence best concludes that paragraph? Well, what's this paragraph about? I'm not sure how much American history I learned on my trip, as my powers of concentration were taxed merely reading road signs. So her conclusion is about what? She couldn't really focus on, the monuments, the landmarks, the attractions. It was about, getting through this expressway. I have to drive through all this traffic and all these people and blah, 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 blah. Ugly construction, no scenery. Driving. Well, what would make sense to put there? F. However, my ability to merge in traffic improved immensely. Yeah, that's like a cute little fun way of concluding it. As in, she spent so much time driving, she was able to improve her ability to merge in traffic. Means, like, let's say there's a car there, I can drive in front of it. Things like that. What about G? Nevertheless, I did learn a lot about the Washington Monument and the Jefferson Memorial. Well, maybe she did, but nothing in the essay or the passage indicates at all that she spent any time at these places or that she learned anything about them. Okay? So that wouldn't make sense. And the whole passage anyway is just about the driving, right? The expressway. It's not about the monuments. What about H? Washington's celebrated monuments or landmarks are truly inspirational. Well, that's random. That's just talking about the landmarks in general. That's completely separate from what she's been talking about in the passage, meaning her own experiences and her own impressions of the Beltway. And then J, opportunities, nevertheless, for learning this history abound in our nation's capital. Again, this is a bit random. It's not really focused on her experiences driving and dealing with this expressway. So the only answer choice that makes any sense is F. All right, good job. That's it for this passage. We'll be moving on to passage 5 for the ACT English Practice Test 3 whenever you're ready.